I should say that when I received the invitation to take part in this conference, I stayed really, really honored. And now I'm feeling a little stressed, remembering the speech of Teresa yesterday with a good stress, a very good one. And I should start thanking again to Manuel, to Alex, to Chris, to Maria, to Livia, to Mandy, because you made this possible. I think it's a very, very good conference, and it could put together people from so many different fields that think so different about the same object. And I think that is the richness of this conference. And when the invitation arrived, the first thing that actually caught my attention was the title of the conference. So, strategies to reduce violence by 50% in the next 30 years is a very big, ambitious aim. And actually, I should confess, I was a little indisciplined, but civilized. And in my speech here, I will bring a very little example to help us to think about this big picture. And my task here is to talk about strategies to reduce youth violence in highly risky areas. It is much more difficult. We all know that how to reduce and work with violence is challenging. And I have a hard task here. Why? Because these highly violent areas, they actually concentrate so many different problems, all so complex, that it's very, very hard to achieve and to work with a difficult theme such as violence. And also because in such areas, it's quite hard to have reliable and accessible information to work with. So let's start at my timer now. So when we talk about violence prevention today, it's quite impossible to not mention all the effort WHO is doing to systematize all the knowledge we are producing. And I think that the World Report on Violence and Health, published in 2002, it's a quite important mark in this process. Not only because WHO brings into light the global magnitude of the program and the public health consequences of it, but mostly because in this report, WHO actually systematize what is this public health approach to violence and give us a theoretical framework to understand violence and to think about prevention. And I'm talking about the ecological model that probably all you know this. In the same report, WHO gives us what are the main risk factors for youth violence. And there they say that youth violence is the most visible form of violence in many different societies. You can see youth violence through the presence of gangs in the streets, at schools. We can see youth violence through homicide. We can see youth violence through non-fatal aggression. And I think that among these, youth homicide is the most visible and the most catastrophic type of violence, and this is quite obvious why. And it's quite impressive how youth homicide take huge magnitudes in some societies. For example, in Brazil, we have from year 2000 to 2002, 649,000 homicides, 80% in the young population. Only in 1 year, in 2012, we had in Brazil 56,000 homicides, 80% in the young population. For us, homicide is the first cause of death in the young population. Consider all types of death, natural and external cause of death. And it is the first cause of potential year of life lost since the end of the 90s. So this is a huge problem for us. This is quite impressive. And we also in this report, WHO give us an idea of what are the main risk factors for youth violence, always following the ecological model. And this risk factor involves components of the individual level, psychological, biological behavior, and the relationship level, including family relationships and peer relationships, in the community level, and in the broad society. And we had here the speech of Manuel that brought us many important components to think the importance of these broad societal determinants to homicide and to violence. And you should think that all these different levels are interconnected in a very dynamic relationships between individual, relationship, community, and society. And it's this dynamic interconnection that appears in violent behavior and appears also in the society levels of violence. So we have by now lots of knowledge about risk factors for violence, about evaluation of violence prevention programs, but it was also said yesterday many times that most part of its evidence comes from the US and European. We have still little knowledge about this, specific knowledge from low and middle income countries that are usually countries that have very high violent rates. So most part of this knowledge focus on specific risk factors, most of them individual risk factors, and most part of the violence prevention also focus very well delimited risk factors. And we have a lack of evaluation coming from the low and middle income countries. I quote here a recent systematic review that Robert published in 2003 about impact evaluation of youth violence prevention in Latin America and the Caribbean, and even considering the scarce evidence from highly qualitative, of high quality evaluation, they give us a systematization of what is working in such areas. So they mention school-based and educational programs, communication campaigns, youth development programs, early child development, and gender-based violence prevention program. I will quote a little passage of this article because I think it's quite important to think about this. The limited number of high-quality impact evaluation of youth violence intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean suggests that there is a weak evidence base for determining what works and what does not. And I think that this is something that we really should care about when we have this aim of a global reduction of violence in 50% in the next 30 years. Why? Because contextual factors are extremely important. As contextual factor, I'm talking about characteristics of the communities, the political components, cultural norms. They are important to understand violence, and they are also important once they can change and interfere in the way violence prevention programs are implemented and also in their results. They can at least shape the way the individual risk factors are expressed, the way these risk factors are translated into violent behavior and expressed in society levels of violence. So I will focus now in a specific context, and my context is São Paulo. You all know that São Paulo is enormous. São Paulo is a very big city. We have now in São Paulo more than 11 million inhabitants, and we had a huge growth in population in a very small time frame. From the 60s to the 80s, the population grew 155% in São Paulo. We passed from 3 million to 9 million. And this brought us many good things and also many bad things. We have in São Paulo a huge inequity, a chaotic traffic. I don't know if you have been to São Paulo. It's a lovely city, but it's quite hard one. We have pollution, and we have, in some areas, very, very high violence rate, what is our focus here. Despite the fact that we are having in Brazil important expansion in social policies all over the years, we still have some areas, even in São Paulo, with an inadequate government capacity in what concerns health, education, housing, and violence and security. In what concerns specifically violence and security, we still deal with gross human rights violations. I'm talking here about police violence, I'm talking here about lynching, and I'm talking here about execution, extrajudicial killings. We deal with police violence in the streets, side by side, by the use of torture in police investigation and the use of torture inside the prison system. We have many denouncements being made by international human rights organizations in what concerns these specific problems. The 90s were a period from the 90s up to the beginning of year 2000 when we faced a huge crisis in the prison system and lots of rebellions inside the prison system in São Paulo. And we have the three that are quietly known. The first one is the rebellion in the Carandiru prison that ended with the execution of 111 inmates by the police inside the prison. And we had two mega rebellions, what we call mega rebellions that happened at the same time in different unities. We have two mega rebellions, one in 2001 that involved 29 different unities, and another in 2006 that involved 49 different units, all articulated by a criminal organization that is called the PCC, that is the first command of the capital. Besides this, we still deal with impunity. Manuel said yesterday that in the case of homicide, only 5 to 8% ends in a sentencing, ends all the process to the prosecution, only consider homicide in Brazil. So, as the rest of my country, homicide level started to grow during the 80s in São Paulo. From 98 to 2000, homicide mortality rate grew 240%, from 17 to 60 per 100,000 inhabitants. And in the middle of the 90s, São Paulo presented one of the most higher homicide mortality rate considered all Brazilian state capitals. There is São Paulo, with the second one, more than 60 per 100,000. And here are the figures for the young population. 125, 104, 56. These figures here are from 2001. In some specific areas, we face still higher rates. In Cidade Tiradentes, for example, homicide mortality rate is 218. And we have many other neighborhoods, districts, not neighborhoods, districts, it's bigger areas, where homicide mortality rate is superior to 100 and to 150. And I think this table is also quite interesting, so we can see how inequity the distribution and the risk of homicide death is in our city when we consider specifically the young population, this first column in here. So the fact that homicide is not even distributed is not specific of São Paulo. We have lots of studies being done in different cities around the world that shows that higher rates are concentrated in areas that present many other social disadvantages. This is not different in São Paulo. This area also concentrates higher occurrence of police violence, lynching, and extrajudicial killings. But something happened in São Paulo. That's where we are now, here. Now we present the lower homicide mortality rate. Consider all state capitals in Brazil. It was a huge drop, and it is a consistent drop that started in the year 2000 and that is still present right now. The homicide mortality rate in São Paulo now is lower than 20, and here are the figures for the young population. Look how it changed. It's now 27, 27, and 19. We passed from higher than 100 to something around the 20s. If we look to the absolute number, the number of homicides, we passed from 6,000 in year 2000 to 1,000 homicides. It's too much. No, it's not a small number, it's not a small rate, but it's a huge difference. It was a huge drop. That's the question. What can explain such a huge fall in such a small time frame? And when I asked this question, I remember two questions posed by two very distinct scholars. I don't know if you know them, Manuel Eisner and Eisner and Nivette, in their paper, How to Reduce the Global Homicide Rate to 2 per 100,000 by 2060. And these two questions were, is it possible to reduce homicide globally to reach the levels of pacified society? How? By what means? And I think that what they would actually want to know is how it's possible to reduce effectively homicide. And what is our role as researchers and as policymakers to help reach this aim? And I like to propose that we take the example of São Paulo and to think that when we talk about an effective reduction of homicide, we need to go beyond the drop in homicide and try to understand the process by which homicide fell in different societies, considering that an effective reduction should be high in magnitude, consistent and sustainable in time, and reached by means that do not violate the rule of law and do not violate the rights of the people. We still face high homicide mortality rates in Brazil. These are the trends for Brazil. They are quite stable. The global rate now in 2012 is 29 for the whole country, and in the young population it is 59, 50, and 32. Here we can see the trends of external age-standardized external cause mortality rate in São Paulo. Now this is the drop in São Paulo, and we can see that only homicide fell. And if you consider all the crimes like robbers, this fall is quite exclusive of homicide. And homicide fell between male and female, mostly in the male population. The rates for the female population, they are small, but that was a fall. It fell in different skin color. It's quite hard to talk about race and ethnicity in Brazil. We are a very mixed population, but the fall was observed in different skin color groups, all the age groups, but mostly in the young population, where the fall reached a higher level, almost 80%, and mostly with homicide committed with firearms. Here is in a specified weapon. We had a bad quality in information and kind of weapon in the end of the 90s, and this is getting better. But homicide fell mostly in firearm homicides. And São Paulo is divided in 96 administrative districts that are minor areas. In 89 of these 96, homicide fell. The darker areas are the areas where we have higher drops, where the fall was more intense, but it was actually something that happens in all the city. It's not a located phenomenon. Some of these areas where we had a huge drop are two examples, Jardim Ângela and Cidade Tiradentes. Jardim Ângela was well known in the middle of the 90s. There was a work done by, I think that by UNDP, I'm not sure now, that said that Jardim Ângela was the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. We had very high homicide rates, and in Jardim Ângela the fall was 77%, and in Cidade Tiradentes it was even higher, 85% drops in 10 years. Some global trajectory models we conducted in analysis and conducted in São Paulo shows that the districts are aggruppated in 4 different trajectories, but the main difference between them is the intensity of the drop. Now, in all of the groups, we can see a reduction, but the magnitude of the reduction is different. And the areas that present the higher drop are the areas that concentrate disadvantage, more unemployment, more family disruption, lower formal jobs. So are the areas that concentrate all those complex problems that I mentioned in the beginning, characteristics of highly violent areas. Beside the fall, even considering the fall, we didn't have a change in the distribution of the risk of death. We still have a huge inequity, and the same areas that were initially the most violent areas continue to be the most violent areas. But now the extreme rates are not more 5 and 110. The low rate in the year 2000 was 5, and the higher was 110 for the whole population, not for the young population. Now the extreme rates are 2 and 44. So we had a reduction, a global reduction all over the city in male, female, youth, but the distribution of the risk is quite the same. When we look for these trends in São Paulo, we can think we are looking to a successful example of a homicide reduction in a violent area. And lots of hypotheses were raised to explain this. What happened? The hypothesis included all the changing and the investment that we had in São Paulo in the public security area, mostly in information and policy intelligence, the disarmament actions and the disarmament law, but it was actually approved in 2005. The actions of many NGOs that are conducting many different violence prevention strategies that have as direct or indirect objective to reduce violence, to prevent violence. The whole of the municipal administration, change in demography, mostly the reduction in youth in the population, and the presence and the force and the structuration of this criminal organization that is the first command of the capital PCC. Our time series analysis show that homicide mortality rate are correlated with the reduction in the percent of youth in the population, with a reduction in unemployment, with higher state investment in health and sanitation, with state and municipal investment in public security, with the growth in incarceration rate. We had a huge growth in incarceration rate in São Paulo, very huge in this period, and with the apprehension of firearms. But unfortunately, you cannot measure the presence of a criminal organization. We still don't have a good indicator to include this in quantitative analysis. So we carried on some qualitative studies in São Paulo. And our aim with this study was first to see how is the population perceiving this. Are they think that homicide is actually falling? And what does this mean for them? And how they explain this fall? And during these studies, we interviewed a community leader that gave us a very good metaphor to see what is going on. And she said, look, what I noticed is that it's just like, so this was my translation, so if it doesn't make sense, I can explain. So, what I noticed is that this is just like a stream of a river. You look and think that water is quiet, but you know that below the strong flow is passing. The feeling I have is this, it's okay, but you know that the strong water is running down the stream. The feeling I have is this. So according to those who live in those areas and according to those that work in those areas, homicide fell. That's indubitable, unquestionable. But this does not mean that they are feeling safer. They say, we don't see no more but dead bodies in the street, what they used to see. But we don't feel unsafe because organized crime is here. And this is like a bomb that can explode. That's another image that they gave us. And also because of police violence. That's the two components that act together to help to give them this unsafe feeling. Organized crime and police violence. So they brought to us many explanations to tell how they explain what they think that actually happened in São Paulo. They said that it was related to better living condition. Kids are at school, we have better unity facilities, we have more employment, better living condition, housing condition. That's something that is a big difference in their lives. And that's something they put in the basket to explain why homicide fell. They also mentioned the importance of the big presence of NGOs. We have areas in São Paulo with a huge presence of NGO doing very, very good job. And I remember just Soda Paz, for example, and many others that are working with violence directly, indirectly, and that are in the field, that are implementing programs, mostly working with education, also working with the police. And there's something going on in the field, and that's something that also, maybe we are now put in our basket the fruits. You know, we are actually seen the result of this. They also mention the presence of organized crime and the change in public security and police. I should say that the investment in public security and the police was mostly mentioned by the representative of the police force. For the population, the police is violent, they don't trust the police. Obviously, there are exceptions, but the main view is that the police is violent and they don't trust the police. So I just read very shortly two little histories here. The case of Rafael, that show us how this mechanism is operating. The case of Rafael, a youth that was born in São Paulo in 1982, sentenced to death in a crime tribunal because he was accused of rape and of being a traitor when he was 24 years old, is an example of this mechanism. Rafael dropped school when he was 18 because his girlfriend got pregnant. He was born in a traditional family, being the second son of 3. When he was 16, he started to frequent an evangelic church where he met Ana Maria, his future wife. They married, had 2 children. He started to work early, mostly with his father, through different informal jobs. In one of such jobs, he met new friends, had an affair, changed his life, as a friend said. Rafael started to drink and to use drugs. He dropped out his job, started to take distance from his family. And one of his new friends was a drug dealer. One day, he invited Rafael to go out with 2 other friends. He didn't know, but they were going to kill another drug dealer, and Rafael was a witness of this crime. The fight between the 2 drug dealers and the murder launched a series of menaces. Crime tribunal was called to end up the story, and Rafael was sentenced to death. He was tortured, his body was diced and abandoned in a vacant lot in a wheelbarrow in June 2006. Also in 2006, another young man named Gabriel was murdered in São Paulo. Those are only 2 among the thousands of homicides that actually happened in the city. Gabriel and 3 of his friends was executed by the police near his house, in the car wash where he used to work and spend his days with friends. He also quitted school after he was caught by the police stealing wires in the street. Gabriel used to go to school, but after his imprisonment, he said, people started to look different to him, he felt stigmatized and decided to stop studying. He started to work, minor informal jobs, used drugs, marijuana, but he was not a dealer, said his mother. He was actually a good boy that stopped doing wrong things after his imprisonment. But once he liked to stay in the streets, used to smoke marijuana, and was friend of some dealers, the police was always approaching to him. His murder was committed during the mega rebellion in 2006, when the first command of the capital started a war against the police in São Paulo. Buses were fired. Police were killed. Police stations were targeted of bombs. São Paulo closed. The streets were silent. Quite impressive what happened in those days. As a retaliation, after the end of the attack, some vigilant groups formed by policemen killed many civilians, most of them not involved in criminal activities, and Gabriel was one of such victims. So we have now in São Paulo lots of discussion about the legitimacy of PCC as a social control mechanism. And you have many ethnographic studies that say that the PCC is one of the major causes for homicide reduction in São Paulo. I doubt, and I need to doubt because it's a very difficult thing to deal with. But I think that that's something we need to deal with. That's something we need to think about. PCC has very strong rules, very strict codes, and very clear penalty. And the death penalty is one of such. And what people say is that as part of the social control mechanism, the right to kill is now regulated. This is no more an individual decision. I don't can individual decide to kill you because you made something to me. This decision needs to be discussed, and I need to be authorized to do this. So the same studies say that these crime tribunals, that also called debates, they are being called to interfere in minor conflicts like love affairs, money debt, minor tensions. There's something that is acting with some instance of regulation. How much this is real, how much this is a myth, I don't know. It's very difficult to answer this question for sure, but that's something that it's in our table to discuss. As a conclusion, the homicide reduction in São Paulo coexists with a feeling of unsafety. Many part of the youth population still live in the border of legality. Some of them, an expressive part of them, included in informal networks, mostly informal labor and drug dealer. The state is seen as ineffective and violent, mostly because of police violence and stigmatization practices from the part of the police, but also because of political corruption and the insufficiency of social programs. So that's why we started saying that high-risk violent areas put to us additional challenges. And these challenges involve the concentrated disadvantage, the fragmentation of social relationships, the lack of trust in one another and in state institutions, the lack of opportunities, state corruption, police violence, the presence of strong criminal organization, firearms and easy access to firearms and drugs, and still the occurrence of gross human rights violation, that all contribute to build an environment where the socializing process facilitates the adoption of risky and violent behavior from the part of the children and the youth. So the violence reduction in high violent area that suffer of a syndrome of characteristics, as said also both our colleagues here, should go beyond fragmented and focused violence prevention program, including actions to reduce police violence and other human rights violations. Remember of something that was discussed here. I think we need to work with the police. We need to include the judicial system. We need to deal with the problem of impunity. And those actions should promote a positive presence of the state institution, broaden the opportunity for the youth to be involved in legal and formal networks, strengthening the social cohesion and trust, and reducing the power of criminal organization. Broad and comprehensive programs, including both state and civil societies, are an important step to achieve an effective homicidal violence reduction in following years. And by effective, I comprehend a reduction that should be high magnitude, consistent and sustainable in time, and reached by means that do not violate but actually reinforces the rule of law. Thank you. That's it.